Chapter 31 of the Three Midshipmen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording done by Jules Harlock of Mississauga, Ontario, Canada. The Three Midshipmen by William Henry Giles Kingston. Chapter 31. On Board the Junk. While the French lady and her daughter, with Mr. Hudson, the American mate, one seaman, and Hodidodi, were carried off by one junk, the two midshipmen, Captain Willox and Josh, with the remaining seamen, found themselves stowed away on board another. "I say, Alick, we must try and help those poor ladies somehow or other," observed Jack. "I hope the pirates will not hurt them." "I hope not, though I'm afraid they will frighten the poor mamma out of her wits," said Murray. "But without being selfish, we must first consider how we are to get free ourselves." "Something may turn up in the wheel of fortune," returned Jack. "We very nearly effected our escape. Perhaps the next time we shall be more fortunate. At present I cannot say that I see any opening by which we may bring about that desirable event." As he spoke he looked round the little cabin in which they were shut up, with a disconsolate yet half ludicrous air. The prisoners were sitting with their backs to the bulkheads, and their feet towards the centre of the chamber. The door was locked, and there was no lookout except through the chinks between the bamboos which formed the sides. They discovered by the motion of the vessel that there was a stiff breeze, and that they were sailing along very rapidly. In vain they tried to ascertain in what direction they were sailing. They looked through the chinks, but all they could see were the figures of the crew as they moved about the deck, and the inner part of the bulwarks and the back of the shields which hung up above them. Hunger is a strong motive to exertion. It had the effect, when after a time the party began to feel its pangs, of making them somewhat less quiet than at first. Some of the men were for trying to break out of their prison, but Captain Willox assured them that the attempt would be useless, and suggested that Josh should try the power of his eloquence in softening the hearts of their captors. Josh expressed his approval of the proposed plan, and forthwith began a loud chant, which he informed his fellow prisoners was descriptive of their present forlorn and famished condition, of the prowess of the warriors of Queen Victoria, and of the certainty that they would revenge any injury inflicted on any of their fellow subjects, as also of their custom of rewarding those who treated them well. "I say," observed Josh, "Queen Victoria knock on de head any one hurt us. Give plenty money any one give us plenty food. Make us fat." "That's it," cried Jack. "Sing away in that strain. They understand that sort of reasoning better than any other argument." On went Josh again with his chant, the commencement of which sounded very like: "Hi fum diddle I, ho fol low, Tittlebat's cat's called toll de roll low." It is not necessary to give the whole of the song. Josh assured his companions that it was very pathetic, and that if it did not move the hearts of the pirates, he would not believe that they had any hearts at all. Whether the pathos, or the threats of vengeance, or the hopes of reward held out had most effect is uncertain. But in a short time the door of the cabin was opened, and a Chinaman appeared with a big copper bowl or pot in his hands, full of a hot savoury mess. He looked at Josh and nodded, as much as to say, "We heard you," and then placed the bowl in the middle of the cabin. There were some chopsticks in the bowl, but no spoons or knives or forks. Captain Willock looked at them with a puzzled air. If those are toothpicks, they are whoppers, and I must say I would rather they were not there," he observed as he tucked back the cuff of his coat. "However, I suppose we mustn't be particular, and as I guess we're all equal just now, here goes." Saying this, he plunged his fingers into the bowl and drew forth a suspicious looking mass. He gazed at it for a time, then shut his eyes and plunged it into his mouth. "A wise proceeding," observed Jack, as he and Alex, following his example, did the same. The rest of the party were not so particular, and only opened their eyes rather wider than usual, as odd-looking particles of food were fished out of the bowl. It was very soon emptied, for as everybody was hungry, they were all eager to get their due portions. Most of them at first fancied that they could have eaten twice as much. However, when Jack and Alick leaned back again against the bulwarks, they were soon convinced that they had had enough. In a little time the door opened again, and another man, who looked from his richer clothes and manner like an officer, popped in his head and beckoned to Captain Willox and the two midshipmen to come out of the cabin. They, happy to have the opportunity of stretching their legs, jumped up with alacrity and followed him on deck. Jack's first impulse was to look out for the junk which had Miss Cecile and her mother on board, but she was nowhere to be seen. Their junk was, however, standing down towards a fleet of considerable size. As there was a stiffish breeze, they were soon among them, and from the hailing and talking and chattering, and the way in which they themselves were pointed at, the junks had pretty evidently not met for some time. Josh, who was shortly after this allowed to come out of the cabin, told them that they were right in their conclusions. The whole fleet now made sail together, and stood to the eastward. The night, when they were all shut up again in the same cabin, was not over pleasant. When daylight broke, the door was opened, and they were allowed to go out. It was a perfect calm, and the pirates were propelling the huge junks, so unwieldy in appearance, with long oars, or rather sculls, through the water at no inconsiderable rate. There was evidently an object in this speed, for the Chinamen are not given to exert themselves without a cause. Perhaps they are in pursuit by an enemy, and if so, we have a chance of being rescued," observed Jack, as he first went on deck. "No, I think not. See, the whole fleet are steering for the same point," answered Murray. "Ah, look ahead. What do you see there?" "A brig, and I do believe a brig of war," exclaimed Rogers. "I shouldn't be surprised if she proves to be the Blenny. If she is, the pirates will find that they have caught a Tartar. She is not unlike your little brig, certainly, but at this distance it is impossible to say," remarked Murray. "But even a brig of war in a calm, surrounded by this host of junks, will have great odds against her. Still, our fellows will do their best." "Of that I am very certain." "That they will, there's no doubt about it," observed Captain Willock. "You Britishers fight well, I guess, and no wonder, when you had us to practise with." "I wonder, captain, that you do not declare that the Yankees taught us to fight," said Jack, laughing. "And so we did, I guess," quickly answered the skipper. "We taught you a trick or two, at all events." "What was that?" asked Jack. "To keep awake," answered Captain Willock. "It is the first thing for a soldier or sailor to do, you allow, and before that time you are apt to go to sleep now and then, I calculate." "Perhaps you are right, captain," said Murray. "But what was the other trick you taught us?" "Not to despise your enemies, I guess," answered the skipper. "You despised us, and we beat you. You did not despise the French, who were 10 times better soldiers than the Americans were, and had 50 times better generals than we had, and you beat them. There was the difference. Never think meanly of the people with whom you are fighting. Believe that you will drub them in the end. That's all right. But only fancy you can do so with a great deal of trouble and hard fighting, and always believe that they are about to play you some trick or other. That's my philosophy about fighting. I'd advise you to take up the same and stick to it. And this brings me to that brig of yours out there. You make sure that she'll drub the junks. Just take care that the junks don't drub her. Not but that I know what your people are made of, and next to our people there ain't any people who fight better in the world when they're put to it. That I'll allow, but—" "All right," exclaimed Jack, who did not wish to discuss the subject, "but see what these cunning rogues are about." While the above discussions were going on, the fleet of junks had separated into 4 divisions. One led, keeping away so as to give a respectful berth to the brig. 2 others branched off on either side, and one, which was the junk which bore the midshipmen and their fortunes, gave up sculling and remained stationary. It was very evident that the intention of the pirates was completely to surround the brig. After a time, the last named division began once more to creep slowly on, and the circle being formed, the whole advanced, decreasing it by degrees, till they got within range of the brig's guns. So eager were the pirates that they paid little attention to their prisoners, who all therefore assembled on the deck to watch proceedings. "She is the Blenny, there is no doubt about it," cried Jack. "Our fellows will not knock under as long as a man remains alive on the deck to fight her guns." The Chinese knew that their shot would not fly across the brig so as to hit their friends on the other side of her, so as they closed in their circle became complete, with short distances only between each junk. The prisoners also watched proceedings with such intense interest that they totally forgot the danger to which they themselves were exposed. "I wish that the brig would open her fire and give it to these scoundrels well," cried Jack. "I wonder that they don't begin." He had scarcely spoken when there was a flash and a report from one of the brig's guns, and a shot struck the junk just astern of them. Several of the Chinese fired in return, but their shot scarcely reached the brig. The pirate admiral or commodore, on seeing this, threw out signals to close in still more, and as the junks began to move, the Blenny let fly both her broadsides at the same moment, several of the shots striking the junks and ripping open their sides. This in no way daunted them. They seemed resolved on the destruction of the brig. The sculls were still more vigorously plied, and they advanced rapidly, till they had got her well within range of their guns, and now from every side they opened on her, while she replied in the most spirited way, firing her guns as rapidly as they could be hauled in, loaded, and run out again. The shot from the pirate's junk told, however, with very considerable effect on her, and the midshipmen had too much reason to fear that many of their friends must have lost the number of their mess. The pirates all seemed to aim at the hull of the brig. They expected, apparently, that the calm would continue, and all they wanted was to kill as many of the Englishmen as they could before they attempted to board her. "I say, I guess your friends aboard there will be getting the worst of it if this sort of fun lasts much longer," observed the Yankee captain to Murray. "I'm afraid so, indeed," answered Alick, with a deep sigh and a sinking of the heart. "I wish we were aboard to help them. I guess, now, we should have a better chance of helping them by being aboard here," answered the captain. Alick thought so likewise. He and Jack were glad that they were not compelled to fight against their countrymen. The larger number of the junks had placed themselves ahead and astern of the brig, and kept pouring in a raking fire on her. To avoid this as much as she could, she got out her sweeps, but they continued to change their positions as often as she got her head round, so that the English had not a moment's respite. The pirates shouted with delight as they saw the success of their plan. They, of course, thought it would be a great thing to cut off an outer barbarian man of war, and anticipated no small amount of valuable plunder as their reward. They, however, were all this time not escaping scot-free, for the brig's shot went through and through the hulls of their junks, and several of them were reduced to a sinking condition, while the musketry of the marines told with no little effect on their decks. Still they had the advantage of an immense superiority in numbers, and although they might lose twice as many men as the crew of the brig numbered, they might still come off victorious. Nearer and nearer crept the junks. For some time no people were killed on board the one which had captured the midshipmen. This made her captain and crew grow bold, and approach still nearer to the Blenny. "They would be wiser if they kept at a distance," observed Rogers. "They'll catch it to a certainty." "Perhaps they hope to bring the combat to a conclusion," remarked Murray. "They'll not do that, let me tell them, in a hurry," exclaimed Jack. "They little think what sort of a fellow they have to deal with in Hemming. He'll give them more than they expect." While Jack was speaking, several shots came crashing on board the junk, killing 5 men, wounding others, and knocking away part of the bulwarks. The wounded men set up the most terrific cries, and their shipmates, anxious to avoid a second edition of the same dose, put about and sculled off to a more respectable distance. Another junk, the next in line, was not so fortunate. The greater part of a broadside struck her. The midshipmen saw her reel with the shock, and immediately she began to sink lower and lower, till down she went, and the water washed over the spot where she had just before floated. Numbers of her crew went down with her or followed her to the bottom. Very few of the neighbouring junks took the trouble of lowering their boats to pick up the remainder, and numbers were drowned in sight of their countrymen, by whom, with a little exertion, they might have been saved. The engagement had now lasted several hours, and neither side had gained any material advantage. Some junks had been sunk, and a good many Chinamen killed, but as a set off against this, there could be no doubt that the brig had lost several men. Jack, too, observed that she now only fired when the junks pressed very close round her, and he could not but suspect that she was running short of ammunition. The evening was drawing on. It was a question whether darkness would favour the crew of the brig, or make her enemies bolder. She at length ceased firing, and manning all her sweeps, she began to move forward, very clearly with the intention of fighting her way out from among the pirates. "She is coming towards us. Hurrah!" cried Jack. "Now, if we could but knock the fellows aboard here on the head, we might render her some help." "Don't be trying that on," said Captain Willock. "We shall only lose our lives if we make the attempt." "But I must get on board her somehow or other," answered Jack, as he spoke, kicking off his shoes and throwing off his jacket. It had now grown very dark, though the constant flashes of the guns kept the scene well lighted up. The Blenny could be seen, though she had ceased firing, gliding on towards them. The pirates had been taking no notice of their prisoners for some time. The brig had got within a cable's length of them. "Now or never," cried Jack. "Alex, in case I am drowned, you'll do all I have asked you." And without waiting for a reply, he sprang over the side of the junk, and catching hold of a rope, let himself down into the water without a splash, and struck off towards the brig. The pirates did not understand what he was doing till he had reached the water. At first they thought he was in despair going to drown himself, but when they saw him swimming away they began to fire at him with the jingals. Favoured by the darkness, he was soon out of their sight. To avoid the sweeps he had to make a wide circuit, and he was pretty well tired when he got under the stern of the brig. "Brig ahoy! Heave a rope here, and help me aboard," he sang out. "A man overboard!" exclaimed someone from the after part of the deck. "Pass a rope here. Be smart now. Heave!" "Who is it? Who is it?" cried several voices. "It is I, Jack Rogers. Be quick now, for I've had a long swim," cried Jack. He soon got hold of the rope which was heaved to him, and was hauled on board over the stern. "What! Rogers, my dear fellow, is that you?" exclaimed Captain Hemming, as he grasped his hand. "Where have you come from?" Jack told him, and urged that they should immediately board the junk he had left, and rescue the rest of the prisoners. "My only doubt is, whether we can get alongside her," answered Captain Hemming. "However, we will try. I am glad to engage in any work with cold steel. But, Rogers, I am sorry to say that our ammunition is almost expended, and though we will not yield as long as a man remains alive to fight, I look with apprehension to what may occur." The brig was now approaching the junk, which fired away furiously at her, but this did not stop her progress, and before the pirates knew what was going to happen, she dashed alongside. "Lash her to the junk. Boarders, follow me." Jack had seized the cutlass, and dripping with wet, he sprang on board by the side of his commander. "Alick, Captain Willock, friends, all get on board of the brig as fast as you can," he sang out. Murray and the rest of the prisoners were ready enough to follow his advice. Seizing what weapons they could lay hands on, they cut down or knocked over all the pirates who opposed them, and soon gained the deck of the brig. The boarders in the meantime cleared the junk, the greater number of her crew who escaped their cutlasses jumping overboard and perishing in the sea. The seamen then hove overboard all the guns of the junk, and returned to the brig. They would have set her on fire, but had they done so, they would very likely have got burnt themselves. "That's one enemy less, my lads," cried Captain Hemming in a cheerful tone, though he felt anything but cheerful. "We must treat the rest in the same way." The pirates on board the other junks, discovering what had occurred, took very good care to keep out of the way of the brig. Captain Hemming, therefore, spent the whole night in trying in vain to get alongside some more junks, and when morning dawned they appeared formed in a close circle round her as on the previous day. Those on board the Blenny had passed an anxious and harassing night. The prospect for the following day was gloomy indeed. The second lieutenant, a midshipman, and 8 men had been killed, and 20 were wounded, and many of them put out of fighting trim. Jack and his companions afforded, therefore, a very welcome addition to their strength. With the daylight the pirates began to fire away as on the previous day. Rogers and Murray, however, now felt very differently to what they had done on the previous day. Then all the shots they saw fired were against their friends. Now the few Captain Hemming ventured to let fly were against their enemies. At length only 3 rounds remained on board. The brig ceased firing. The pirates thought that the time for boarding her simultaneously had arrived, and, gliding up, closed their circle round her. In vain all on board looked out for the sign of a breeze. Not a cloud was in the sky. The sea was like glass. The sweeps were therefore again manned, and she advanced as fast as they could urge her towards the approaching line. The pirates came on, thinking that she would fall an easy prey into their hands. "Reserve your fire, my lads, till we are close to them," cried the captain. "Now give it to them." The broadsides of the brig were poured into the junks which had ranged up on either beam, with terrible effect. One junk went down, and another was left without a scull to impel her, and with a third of her crew killed or wounded. Still the pirates were undaunted. On they came again to receive another broadside. But one now remained. The junks moved away to a short distance to hold a consultation, it seemed. The result was to renew the attack on the brig. "We'll give her our last dose, lads, to that big fellow who is, I suppose, their admiral," cried Jack, who had taken command of the guns on one side, in place of the lieutenant who was lulled. With a cheer the men obeyed, and the big junk reeled from the effect of their fire. The opposite broadside was discharged at the same time, and now the brig was unarmed, but she still had stout hearts and sharp cutlasses on board, and, grasping the latter, the crew prepared to defend her to the last. End of chapter 31.
Chapter 32 of The Three Midshipmen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Oliver Walton. The Three Midshipmen by William Henry Giles Kingston. Chapter 32. Fight to the Last. The Chinese pirates now made sure that the brig was their own, though so severe was the lesson she had given them that they showed a considerable disposition to approach her with caution. Still, as they drew closer and closer round her, and she no longer continued to fire, they grew bolder in their proceedings. Hitherto the crew of the Blenny were not aware that their powder was exhausted. Captain Hemming thought it better to tell them. "My lads," he exclaimed, in a cheerfuller tone as he could assume, "we've run short of powder, but as I take it, no one would dream of striking to these cutthroats. We'll show them that the British seamen know how to use their cutlasses." The men gave a hearty cheer to show that they responded to their commander's appeal. Still, there were fearful odds against them. The pirate junks pressed on, and though the gallant tars would have despised the crews who manned them, still from their very numbers they might prove overwhelming. "My dear Jack," said Alice in a low tone, "I never thought it would come to this, but it seems the enemy will get the better of us after all. We'll render a good account of them, however, before that." "We will," said Jack, drawing in his sword belt a hole tighter, and clutching his cutlass with a firmer grasp. "That big fellow will be alongside us in half a minute. But, I say, what are those?" He pointed as he spoke, through an opening between two of the junks. All eyes were turned in the same direction. Several dark objects were seen on the water. They were boats. The foam thrown up by their bows glittered brightly as the rays of the sun fell on it, showing the rate at which they were coming on. The British crew gave an involuntary cheer as they caught sight of them. They had no doubt they were friends. So intent had been the pirates on capturing their prey that they had not yet discovered the approach of the boats. The sight gave fresh energy to the British seamen. The big junk at length got alongside the brig, and from her lofty bulwarks down poured the pirates on the deck of the latter. But though they got there, they had reason to wish themselves back again, for the British cutlasses made very speedy work of them, and not 1 in 10 escaped with their lives. Still, even the bravest of the British tars wished that the boats would arrive, for 2 or more huge junks ranged up, one on the Blenny quarter and another on her bows, and they had to divide to repel the pirates who swarmed on their sides. Another and another junk came up, and soon joined outside of the others, so that the pirates had the power of throwing a continual stream of boarders onto the deck of the brig. Had they not known of the approaching boats, hope would have certainly forsaken the crew of the Blenny. A few musket cartridges remained, with which the marines kept up fire on the denser masses of pirates. The smoke they produced, added to that of the guns from the pirates, threw so thick a veil over the scene that the expected boats were no longer visible. More than once Captain Hemming pulled out his watch to ascertain how time sped, and then again had to lead on his men to repel a fresh attack. Several times the British were almost overpowered, and the most resolute bravery alone could have saved them. Suddenly some sharp reports were heard close to them. The masts of several of the junks were observed to be receding, and then arose above the din of the battle 3 hearty British cheers. The hard-pressed crew of the Blenny responded to it, and they had to exert every nerve and muscle to keep their enemy at bay. There were more shouts and shots, and then came shrieks and cries and the clashing of steel, and Terence Adair with little Harry Bevan was seen, followed by a party of seamen cutting their way along the deck of the nearest junk, driving numbers of pirates before them, till they reached the point in contact with the brig, when, with a cry of joy, Terence and Harry leaped down on her deck. The meeting of the friends was brief indeed, but cordial, and then, once more, they separated, each with their followers, to attack in return the junks which pressed around them. At this juncture the brig's royals were seen to bulge out for an instant. There was an evident movement along the junks. The shouts and hurrahs of the British seamen were redoubled. The shrieks and cries of the Chinese increased. The mass of junks surrounding the brig began to break away. Those inside now seemed to be in the greatest hurry to escape. Mr. Sherry's countenance, even in the heat of battle, looking jovial and rosy, was now seen as he fought his way with his boat's crew from deck to deck of the junks, driving their crews into the sea. No quarter was asked by the desperadoes, and the British seamen were not much inclined to give any. The roar of guns was heard. It was the frigate, which was now coming up with a rattling breeze, firing at the flying junks. The pirates made up the most desperate attempt to escape. They cut and slashed away with their axes in the most frantic manner at the grapnels which they themselves had thrown on board the brig, and at the ropes which secured them to each other. And at length those who could not free their junks began cutting their throats, blowing out their brains, jumping overboard, or disemboweling themselves, while others, in the madness of their desperation, fired into their magazines, or threw torches into the holds of their vessels, in the hopes of burning their foes with themselves. In this last amiable intention they did not succeed as well as they expected, for as the junks were by this time pretty well separated, though some blew up and some burned, a great number were captured by the boats. The frigate now got up to the scene of action, and her shot as she passed them sank several more of the junks, which may have escaped, and crippled others, which the boat succeeded in capturing. Jack and Alec had, meantime, with half a dozen followers, boarded a big junk, the crew of which made a most desperate resistance. While engaged in driving the enemy overboard, or otherwise disposing of them, the midshipmen perceived that the junk, which had all her sail set, had got free from the brig and was driving rapidly away from her. They had very severe work, for which the pirates saw themselves free from the brig. They made a stand, which nothing but the most determined courage could have overcome. Again and again the midshipmen and their followers charged them. At last the chief, with most of his officers, was killed, and the rest began to give way. The remainder, finding this, and knowing that there was no chance of escape, began getting rid of their lives in the way which had already been described, the process being considerably aided by their conquerors, till the last gang of them, with terrific shrieks, went overboard together. As to the British seamen attempting to save the lives of any of them, that was impossible, for they themselves even would not allow it. "Hullo!" cried Jack, as the last party of them disappeared, and left the deck clear of all but the dead and dying. "Where are we?" Well, might he ask the question, for the junk had been driving away before the wind, and had by this time got nearly a couple of miles away from the brig. "At all events, we've got an independent command," he continued, when he had ascertained the state of affairs. "And, Alec, I vote we take a cruise by ourselves, and capture some more of the enemy. You and I look like Chinamen already, and we can easily rig out our men in some of the clothes of these fellows, and so I have no doubt we shall be able to get alongside without their suspecting us." Murray thought the notion not a bad one, and the men were delighted with it, very soon transforming themselves into fierce-looking pirates, pigtails and all, for they had rapidly cut off the latter appendages from their conquered foes. The next business was to throw the dead men overboard, and to bind up the wounds of those who still lived, but those who had strength tore off the bandages as fast as they had put them on, and were evidently intent on quitting the world. The midshipmen did all they could to prevent them by keeping their weapons out of their reach, but one fellow got hold of a knife and stabbed himself to the heart, another blew out his brains with the pistol which he drew out of his comrade's pocket, and a third, after his wounds had been bound up and he had little recovered strength, took the opportunity of scrambling overboard. If Jack and Alec had allowed it, the seamen, on observing this, would have thrown the rest of the prisoners after them. "What's the use of coopering up these chaps, if that's the way they goes to behave for themselves?" exclaimed Dick Snatchblock, boatswain's mate, as he caught another fellow by the leg who was attempting to do the same. "Keep quiet, you, I say," and he dealt him a box on the ear which knocked him flat on the deck. They now made sail after 3 junks nearest to them. The whole fleet was scattered far and wide to every part of the compass. "I wish that Hemming and the other fellows on board the brig knew where we were," observed Jack. "We should be reported dead or missing." "They will value us so much more when we make our appearance," answered Murray. "But Jack, look at that junk. Her crew seems to have more spirit than the rest of the scoundrels. They do not seem to be in such a hurry to run away." "They take us for friends," observed Jack. "Perhaps we've got hold of the Admiral's ship, and they probably are bound to wait for him. We shall undeceive them, I guess, pretty soon. See all the guns ready, therefore, and aft will astonish them when they get near us." The two junks drew closer and closer. They were well within range of each other's guns. Jack was on the point of giving the order of fire, when who should jump on the bulwarks of the stranger but Paddy Eyre. Jack jumped up also and waved his hat. He forgot that he looked like a Chinaman, and that all his crew was similarly disguised. A broadside from Paddy's junk and a rattling shot musketry reminded him of the fact. Happily the shot flew high, but he got the upper tip of his ear taken off. He jumped down again on the deck. "What shall we do? We have no ensign with us." "How should we let Paddy know who we are?" he exclaimed. "If he were an enemy I shouldn't care, but to be shot by one's friends is too bad." "Perhaps we may find a tablecloth, or some sheets, or something of that sort," suggested Murray. Nothing of the sort was to be found, and they were expecting every moment that Adair would send them another broadside into them, when Jack bethought him that perhaps a pair of white trousers would answer the purpose of a flag of truce. A pair which had been exchanged for a Chinaman's nether garments was run up the peak, and every other flag was hauled down. This had the desired effect, for Adair did not again fire. As soon as the two junks got within hail, Jack shouted out, "Paddy, ahoy! Paddy, my boy, don't be after blowing up your friends if you love them." Terence jumped up again on the bulwarks and peered eagerly at the big junk. Jack and Alec then showed themselves, and the two vessels were soon alongside of each other. Very little time was lost in greeting, and it was quickly arranged that they would again start off to secure 2 or 3 more junks than they had returned. As, however, during the time they had been approaching each other, the enemy had gotten considerably in advance, and as the frigate in the same movement began to fire guns to recall her boats, they agreed that they ought to return. Another reason, which still had more weight with them, was that they had several of their men wounded, for whom they wished to get assistance. They at once, therefore, hauled their wind, but they had considerable difficulty in beating up towards the frigate, till they bethought them of lowering the junk's leeboard, when they found themselves so wonderfully well to windward. Before dark, the captured junks were assembled under the guns of the frigate and brig. The reception the midshipmen met with on board the frigate was cordial in the extreme. All rejoiced, fore and aft, that Roger and Murray had once again turned up. "Well, it's a mighty satisfaction to be lost for the sake of the pleasure it affords one's friends to see one back again," observed Terence. "And, old fellows, I knew you would come back somehow or another. I always said so. Astride of a dolphin, if in no other way, though Harry here and some of his friends would not believe me." "I am very glad you are right, Paddy," said Jack, "but we haven't done with the pirate yet. The villain have carried off 2 ladies and some seamen, and we must be after them." "We shouldn't lose time either," observed Murray. "We should tell the captain, and get him to send off an expedition at once, to search for them." All agreed to this, so Jack and Alec instantly went to the captain's cabin, and made their report. On hearing it, Captain Grant, without loss of time, organised an expedition, which was placed, as had been the former one, under the command of the indefatigable Lieutenant Cherry. Captain Willock volunteered his services, as did his men, and Terence got leave to accompany it with Jack and Alec. The wounded men were in the meantime removed from the brig. She was furnished with a supply of powder, and the fresh hands were sent to her from the frigate. Captain Hemming was then ordered to cruise in whatever direction the boats might go, to render assistance if necessary. He and his officers were glad of the opportunity, that they might inflict a further punishment on the pirates, should they fall in with them. The question now arose as to the direction in which they should proceed. Captain Willock suggested that they were not likely to be very far off, and as he knew the haunts of the pirates, he undertook to act as pilot. In spite of the attempts of the pirates to destroy themselves, several had been secured alive and unwounded. 2 of the most intelligent, and who seemed to be most willing to be communicative, were selected to accompany the expedition, and they were made to understand by signs that if they assisted in discovering the prisoners, they would be handsomely rewarded. Their little pig eyes glittered where they saw the gold held up to them, and there appeared to be very little doubt they would try to earn it. One fellow, however, made a clutch at it at once, and intimated that he should like to receive the reward first, and do the work afterwards. "Catch a weasel asleep, old fellow," said Paddy, who stood by, making a significant gesture, while the Chinaman seemed to understand fully, for his eyes twinkled more than ever, and he laughed heartily, as if he thought his proposal a very good joke. Jack and Alec, having washed off the stains of gunpowder and blood, with which they were pretty well covered, and reassumed their proper uniforms, declared themselves ready to proceed. They laughed at the notion of wanting rest. "Let us get back the old lady, and the young lady, and the other prisoners, and then we will turn it and take a spell of 24 hours at least," exclaimed Jack as he jumped into his boat. The American master went with Mr. Cherry, as did also the interpreter belonging to the frigate, as without him they could not hope to do so much. The 3 midshipmen each had the command of a boat. They all kept close together, steering to the southeast, for which point the wind was favourable. Light hazy blue hillocks, indicating islands, lay away to the southeast. The brig, having caught up to the boats, took them in tow and stood towards the island, till she got close enough in to be visible from the shore. Then she cast them off, and they stood in alone. It was quite dark before the boats reached the land. They pulled noiselessly along until they reached a sheltered bay, into which they ran, and brought up under a high, rocky point, where they may lay concealed till the return of daylight should enable them to proceed on their expedition. They had passed several such nights since they had come into the China seas, and many more on the coast of Africa, so that there was nothing very particular to interest them. One officer at a time, and 2 men in each boat, were directed to keep watch while the rest went to sleep. It was Jack's middle watch. It is not surprising, considering all the fatigues he had gone through, that he should be very drowsy. Still, he did his utmost to keep awake. He kept pinching himself and rubbing his nose, and then he lit a cigar and tried to smoke, but in spite of it he was conscious that more than once he indulged in a loud snore. His head nodded too, just like that of a person who unfortunately falls asleep in church. He had kept the prisoner who had been committed to his side. The man appeared to be fast asleep. Jack, in spite of his drowsiness, became conscious that something was moving close to them. There was a splash. He started up. The prisoner was not in his place. At a little distance off, a round object popped out of the water. In an instant, Jack, giving a loud shout, was overboard and darting away in chase of the man. The shout he gave and the noise of his plunge woke up the people in other boats, only in time, though, to see the other Chinaman swimming away in the direction taken by his countryman. On this, all the boats slipped their cables and made chase, though there appeared to be a great probability that in the darkness the pirates would effect their escape. End of chapter 32.
Chapter 33 of The 3 Midshipmen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The 3 Midshipmen by William Henry Giles Kingston. Chapter 33. An Old Acquaintance. A swim in the dark through waters where sharks abound, and in chase of an enemy, who may very likely be armed with a sharp creese, is far from an agreeable amusement. Away swam the pirate, and after him swam Jack. "If he has a knife, it won't be pleasant," he said to himself. "However, I must be cautious as I get up to him. Ah, there he is. Now, old fellow, what have you got to say for yourself?" Jack was within about a couple of yards of the Chinese. The man turned his head to look over his shoulder. Jack darted on. At that moment Jack saw an object in the pirate's hand, gleaming from the bright light of a star hitherto obscured. It was a creese. The man turned round to meet him and plunge it into his body. But at the moment he did so, Jack dived down, and coming up on the other side of him, caught him by the legs with one hand, while with the other he grasped the arm which held the weapon. His great difficulty was to prevent the pirate from changing the creese from his right hand to his left. While thus desperately struggling, Jack observed 2 dark heads close to him, with the most fierce and malignant countenances. The men were probably armed with creeses. Jack expected every moment to feel the sharp blades running into him, when the shouts of his friends alarmed his foes, and they darted away in the hopes of securing their own safety. Terence and Alick, meantime, naturally felt very anxious for Jack's safety. They shouted loudly his name. "All right," he sang out. "I have got a fellow, but he is as slippery as an eel, and very hard to hold. Lend a hand here, do." The tone of his voice showed that he was struggling hard with his prisoner. His friends dashed after him with their boats, but his own boat, of which Needham was coxswain, had already got up to him, and were hauling him and the Chinese on board. "Look after the other 2 fellows. They are away there," he shouted, never for a moment losing his presence of mind. Alick's boat darted after one, Terence's after the other. It was not likely that the men could have got very far, but a black head at midnight on the world of waters is not very discernible. Murray, as his boat pulled on, kept his eyes about him on either side. He caught sight of a head. "There he is!" he cried, leaning forward and making a clutch at the pirate. A creese flashed up as he did so, and he got a cut in his arm which was intended for a more vital part. The next instant the man had disappeared, but as his object was to escape, and not to get drowned, he had to come up again to breathe. As he did so, he got his creese ready to give another plunge with it, but the seamen were not quite so green as he supposed, and this time they were ready with the boat's stretchers, and as he lifted up his arm he got a blow which sent his formidable weapon to the bottom, and well nigh broke his arm. This prevented him from diving, and the next instant he was, in spite of his struggles, hauled into the boat, and he found himself lashed with his hands behind him to the after thwart. There was another prisoner to be accounted for. Terence told his crew not to make a noise as they went in chase. The man was the strongest of the three prisoners. He had taken a circuit, hoping thus to escape unobserved to the shore. It occurred to Terence that this was what very likely one of them would do, and thus before long he caught sight of the man's head as he swam rapidly through the water. "The fellow swims beautifully," thought Terence. "I'll let him enjoy himself a little longer." The noise made on board the other boats deceived the Chinaman. He fancied that he was not pursued. "We must catch him now," thought Terence, after an interval, and he made a sign to his men to give way, when a loud shriek was heard. The pirate's arms were seen to rise up above his head, and then down he went like a shot beneath the waves. Terence shuddered. "Jack Shark has caught him," observed one of the crew, and as they pulled over the spot they could see the water still bubbling and agitated, as if some violent struggle was going on beneath its surface. Then all was quiet. The monster had dragged off his prey to be devoured at his leisure. "I'm heartily glad it was not Jack Rogers," said Terence, as on pulling back he recounted what had occurred. "Thank you," answered Jack. "It was certainly a terrific risk I ran, but as the fellow had escaped through my negligence, I was determined to catch him at all costs." How the pirates had managed to conceal their creeses was a wonder which no one could solve, though the seamen declared that they believed they had kept them hid away inside their throats, for they could not have had them anywhere else. After all the noise that had been made there was little hope of concealment, so Mr Cherry ordered the squadron of boats to pull out of the bay, and to proceed farther along the shore to the eastward. Scarcely had they got round the rocky point which had concealed them, than they saw right before them a dozen or more dark objects, which, after watching for some time, they made out to be as many large rowboats. They hoped that they were not perceived, so Mr Cherry ordered them to pull back under the shadow of the cliff. On came the boats. It was pretty certain that they were pirates, and that by some means, having discovered they were there, their purpose was to surprise them. The guns in the bows of the boats were loaded, as were the muskets which each man had by his side, and the oars were kept out, so that at a moment's notice they might give way after the enemy. As Paddy remarked, they looked like four huge centipedes ready to dart out on their prey. The rowboats must have been too far off at the time of the chase of the three prisoners to have heard the shouting, so they probably hoped to catch the British asleep. Mr Cherry was in doubt whether he should attack them unless they were aggressors. They might, after all, be only harmless traders. They glided on pretty rapidly. Soon they had rounded the point, and were making for the spot where the boats had been, when those on board them discovered the Englishmen. They stopped, and then came dashing on towards the point. "They are enemies," cried Mr Cherry. "Give it to them, my lads." A sharp fire of grape, accompanied by musketry from the four boats, right into the bows of the junks, had the effect of arresting their progress. They could not tell how many more boats there might be behind those they saw. "Reload your pieces, my lads, as fast as you can. Quick!" shouted Mr Cherry. It was done before the pirates had recovered from their confusion, and when they once more advanced, a second dose was ready for them. This was given with such good effect that they pulled round to escape. The commanding officer, observing this, ordered his boats to advance. On they dashed, the men loading and firing as they could, till they reached the junks. Then each boat selecting an antagonist, the seamen leaped on board, and with their cutlasses very soon drove the crew overboard. None of the pirates would yield, and not a prisoner was taken. As some time was expended in this engagement, the remainder of the junks escaped. Where they had gone it was difficult to say in the darkness, but Jack Rogers told Mr Cherry that he thought he had seen them steering for the bay. Into the bay, therefore, the boats proceeded, and pulled round and round it. In vain they searched, however, and at last Mr Cherry ordered them to bring up and wait till daylight. As soon as it was dawn, it was up anchor and out oars, and away they pulled again. They had not gone far before they discovered the boats run up on the beach, deserted by the crews. Paddy Adair and Jack were for dashing in at once, but the more prudent lieutenant called them back. He first ordered that all the guns should be loaded, and pointed towards some suspicious looking bushes on a height above the beach, and then directed Terence to pull rapidly in towards the boats, and to set them on fire. The other boats advanced more slowly, two at a short distance to the right, and two to the left of him. Paddy was very much inclined to think all this precaution superfluous. "What's the use of it, when we have only a set of ignorant niggers to deal with?" he observed to Jack, as he pulled on. "Give way, lads." He reached the beach. A light was struck. There was an abundance of dry driftwood thrown up by gales on the shore. Some of it was speedily collected, and they had succeeded in setting one boat in a blaze, when from the suspicious bushes there came a rattling shower of bullets, and directly afterwards some 50 savages, with creeses in their hands, dashed out towards them. Two of the Englishmen had fallen, and Terence and the rest rushed to their arms to defend themselves as best they could, though they could not help looking round to see if the other boats were coming to their assistance, when from either side so hot a fire was opened with grape and bullets on the pirates, that before they reached the boats they wished to defend, numbers were tumbled over, and the rest turned and fled back into the cover. Before he could allow the boats to advance, Mr Cherry had all the firearms again loaded. Meantime Terence continued to set the boats on fire, and performed the work without molestation. The lieutenant then led the flotilla to a spot where there were no trees or rocks to shelter an enemy, and leaving 3 men in each boat, he landed with the rest, and advanced to the top of a neighbouring hill. There were no habitations in sight, and as it was agreed that it would be worse than useless to follow the pirates, the party again embarked. The wounds of the poor fellows who had been hit were bound up, and all possible attention was paid to them. Notwithstanding this, soon after the boats again shoved off, one of them died. It was impossible to keep the body on board, and as landing was dangerous, a shot was fastened to the feet, and with scant ceremony it was launched into the sea. "Has Bill gone?" asked the other wounded man with a faint voice. "I wish as how he'd waited a bit before he slipped his cable, so that we could have borne each other company. Maybe if I clap on more canvas I shall get up with him. Howsomedever, I shan't be long after him, and that's a comfort." For several hours the boats proceeded on, looking into every bay and creek for signs of inhabitants from whom they might obtain information. At last some huts were seen, and the expedition pulled on for the shore. Mr Cherry and about 25 men landed, and the ground being open, marched up towards the huts, carrying the 2 prisoners with them. One of them was then made to understand that he must go and make inquiries as to whether they knew what had become of the 2 ladies and the other people the pirates had carried off. The man nodded his head, and showed that he fully comprehended what he was to do. While they were speaking, some 30 or 40 natives appeared at a short distance off. Understand," added the interpreter, "you may go as far as that tree, so that you may talk to those people, but if you go a foot farther you will be shot. Remember that we are not joking." The pirate went on, first very slowly, then rather quicker, then faster and faster. The natives shouted, and he cried out something in return. He evidently had friends among them. He reached the tree, he stopped a moment, then he looked back. The marines, looking very grim, with their muskets presented, stood ready to fire. He talked on, then he looked again. The desire to escape overcame all his fears. He sprang forward, but as he did so half a dozen bullets were lodged in his body. No sooner did he fall than numbers of natives rushed out from all directions and began to fire on the English. Giving the marines time to reload, Mr Cherry called his men to charge, and dashing forward with bayonets and cutlasses, they speedily put the enemy to flight. A considerable quantity of European goods of various descriptions was found in the houses, as this proved without doubt that the inhabitants were either pirates or in league with them. The habitations and such goods as could not be carried off were committed to the flames. The fields, gardens, and plantations of every description were likewise ruthlessly destroyed. "It is a cruel necessity," observed Mr Cherry to his subordinates, "but it must be done. The only way that I can see of putting a stop to piracy is to teach the pirates that their trade will not longer answer." Murray was the only one of the party who was not entirely of the lieutenant's opinion. That evening, when they had returned to the boats, he addressed Jack Rogers. "I wonder now whether it might not answer to catch some of these wild fellows, to show them the beauties and advantages of Christianity and civilization, and then send them back among their countrymen as a sort of missionaries. Offer to trade with them, and prove to them that honest commerce will be more profitable to them than dishonest piracy. I think this plan would answer our purpose better than burning down their houses and cornfields." Jack was not quite certain which plan he thought the best. "Ours is the shortest and most simple, at all events," he observed. "I think not, because our present work can never end," answered Alick. "As soon as we disappear, piracy will again appear, whereas if we teach the people the advantages of commerce, they will not only no longer rob themselves, but it will be their interest to aid in putting down piracy everywhere else." "Well, Alick, I do believe you are right, as you always are," said Jack. "But I say, I hope we shall find poor Madame Dubois and Mademoiselle Cecile before long. What a state of fright the poor old lady will be in all this time." While they were talking, their boats being close alongside each other, Terence was attending to the wounded man in his boat. The poor man grew weaker and weaker. "I shall not see another sunrise," he remarked. "Bill won't have a day's start of me, so maybe after all he and I will steer the same course alongside each other." He continued talking in the same style to the last, showing clearly that he had his senses perfectly, but that he was painfully ignorant of the truths of religion. Adair thought that he ought to set him right, but did not know how to begin, and if he had begun, he felt that he should not know how to go on. The seaman's voice grew fainter and fainter. The pale light of a dawn began to appear. Suddenly he lifted himself up, exclaiming with a strong voice, "Yes, Bill, all right. I'm casting off the turns. Good bye, shipmates. I'm after you, Bill." Then he fell back and was dead. Scarcely was the body cold before it too was lowered into the water, and as the sun rose, Mr Cherry gave the order to weigh and continue the voyage. A pleasant breeze sprang up off the land, which carried them along at a good speed. At noon they turned to dine, still continuing under way. A lofty headland was before them. No sooner did they round it than a deep and beautiful bay opened on them, with rocks and high but not precipitous banks. In the very head of it there appeared a large junk anchored close in with the shore. "That's her!" exclaimed Jack and Alick and Captain Willock in the same voice. "It's the very junk which carried off the ladies." "If it's not her, it's as like as one pea is to another," observed the American skipper. She appeared to be full of men, and numbers came scrambling up from below. It was evident that the boats were unexpected visitors. A few shots were fired at the boats. On this Mr Cherry ordered the sails to be lowered, and the oars being got out, away they dashed towards the junk, getting ready to fire as they approached. Scarcely had one discharge been given than the pirates were seen to be making their escape from the junk. Some were lowering themselves into the boats which hung alongside, and others were leaping into the water to swim on shore. The nearer the British drew, the more violent were the attempts the pirates made to escape. By the time the boats had got within 50 yards or so of the junk, the greater number had made their escape, and most of them were seen climbing up the hill, or hiding themselves among the rocks. At that moment half a dozen people were seen on the deck, and it appeared to Mr Cherry that they were about to discharge some of their guns before they made their escape. He was just giving the order to fire when Jack shouted out, "Stop in, stop! They are not pirates. They are Madame Dubois and Miss Cecile, though they are dressed up like Chinamen, and Hudson and Hoddidoddi, and the rest." The crews of Adair's and Murray's boats were, however, in so great a hurry that they fired before Mr Cherry could countermand his order, and then on they dashed. Jack was dreadfully afraid that the ladies might be hurt, and this made him also eager to get alongside to ascertain. This anxiety was, however, speedily relieved by the appearance of Miss Cecile on the upper deck of the junk, waving a petticoat which she had made do duty as a flag of truce. The whole party were soon alongside. Jack was the first on deck. He very nearly burst out laughing when he caught sight of poor Madame Dubois, rigged out in a Chinaman's costume, with her hair twisted into a pigtail, and a little round Chinese hat on her head. Miss Cecile had on the same sort of dress, which Jack did not think particularly became her. Indeed, she appeared to him to be very different to what she had before seemed when she was instructing him in French. All this time the pirates were scrambling away up the rocks as fast as they could go. So great had been the panic that they had not even taken their arms with them, so that they could not interfere with the proceedings of the conquerors. Mr Cherry did not think it worth while to follow them. Indeed, as they appeared to have treated the prisoners well, he did not think that he should do right to inflict on them any further punishment than the loss of their vessel and booty. The junk's huge wooden anchor was therefore hove up to her bows, and the boats, taking her in tow, carried her off in triumph out of the bay. Before leaving, however, Mr Cherry told the interpreter to impress on the minds of the two pirate prisoners that if they returned to their old habits they would be caught, and if caught they would be hung, but that if they took to any honest calling they would be protected and favoured by the British. "Go and tell your countrymen this, and don't forget it yourselves," added the interpreter. The men were then landed, and off they scampered to join their friends; but whether or not they benefited by the advice given them, it is impossible to say. Jack, with Mr Cherry and a few of the men, went on board the junk, when Jack inquired of Miss Cecile how it was she and her mamma had come to assume the attire in which he found them clothed. "Oh, it was all Mr Hudson," answered the young lady. "He say we must to run away, but poor mamma she does look very funny. Ha, ha, ha!" "Your respectable relation has certainly a very curious appearance," answered Jack, not particularly well pleased with Miss Cecile's tone. "It strikes me indeed, young lady, that the sooner she changes her dress the less ridiculous she will appear." Miss Cecile, however, did not seem to care much about this point, and continued laughing as heartily as before. Hudson afterwards explained that, having found a chest of Chinese clothes in the cabin in which they were shut up, they had dressed themselves in them in the hopes that thus disguised they should be the better able to make their escape. Before night the Blenny hove in sight, and taking the boats on board and the junk in tow, the expedition returned to Hong Kong, where they found the frigate at anchor. Jack and Alick here bade the companions of their late adventure good bye. Jack was a little sentimental when parting with Miss Cecile, but he very speedily recovered his usual state of feeling when he heard that she was about to be married to Mr Joe Hudson, the mate of the American brig. While the Dugong and Blenny lay at Hong Kong, Captain Hemming was asked to take a poor young gentleman on board, who had suffered from the climate and was very ill. A trip to sea might give him some chance of recovery. Hemming, in the kindness of his heart, at once consented, without asking who he was, and promised him a berth in his cabin. Scarcely had the stranger been lifted up on deck than Jack recognized in his features, though pale and sunken, those of his old schoolfellow, Bully Pigeon. He was placed in the shade under an awning on deck. He had not been there long before he sent a boy to call Jack. "Ah, Rogers," he said, in a faint voice, "I dare say you scarcely like to speak to me, but I am not as bad as I was. I have been thinking a good deal lately, and a friend has talked to me and read to me, and I have seen my folly. I believe in the religion I once laughed at, and I see that, had I before believed in it, I should have been 1,000-fold more happy than I was. I have thrown life away, for I shall soon die, but I am not miserable as I was lately, for I know that I shall be forgiven." The next day the frigate and brig sailed for the north. They had cruised for about a fortnight when a steamer overtook them and gave them notice that war had broken out once more between England and China, and that there would be plenty of work cut out for them before long. End of chapter 33.
Chapter 34 of The Three Midshipmen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording done by Giles Harlock of Mississauga, Ontario, Canada. The Three Midshipmen by William Henry Giles Kingston. Chapter 34. Promoted. The frigate and the brig, which had the honour of conveying the three midshipmen between them, with the south-west monsoon blowing gently aft, proceeded northward among the numberless islands which stud the China seas, looking for the admiral and the rest of the fleet. They were surprised, as they sailed along the mainland, to observe the great number of towns and villages on the shores, and vast tracts of country under cultivation. Several times they fell in with small squadrons of large government war junks, with heavy guns, gaudy flags, flaunting vainly like peacocks' tails, and stout mandarins sitting on their decks. Some tried to escape and succeeded, but others were caught, and the stout mandarins either were or pretended very much astonished that their vessels were lawful prizes to the squadron of Her Britannic Majesty. They received very little commiseration, for it was well known that they were in league with the pirates who infested those seas, and that when any grand piratical expedition was about to take place, they invariably kept out of the way. Sometimes they passed among the whole fleets of tiny fishing boats, to be counted by thousands, like shoals of fishes, themselves engaged in procuring food for the teeming multitudes on shore, and giving an idea of the vast numbers of the finny tribes which inhabited those seas. Frequently, too, there glided by one of those roguish, rakish, wicked-looking craft, an opium clipper, fleet as the sporting dolphin, and armed to the teeth. For she has foes on every side. The pirates long to make her their prey, and the mandarin junks ought to do so, but dare not. For several hours the frigate and the brig lay becalmed close together. Alex and Terence went to pay Jack a visit. While they were on board, the surgeon sent to tell Jack that Pigeon was very much worse, and desired to see him. Jack hurried into the cabin where he lay. When he heard that his other two old schoolfellows were on board, he begged to see them also. They saw that the stamp of death was already on his countenance. I'm glad you are come," he said in a very faint voice, trying to lift himself up. "I wish to tell you that I have at last discovered that I have lived a life of folly. I thought myself very clever and very wise, but I know now that I was an arrant fool. I have often said things which might have done you a great deal of harm, but my earnest prayer is that you did not listen to them. What I wish you to do is to point to me and guide all your friends or acquaintances against the horrible doctrines which I took up. They only brought me pain and suffering from the first, and well nigh destroyed my soul at the last. Indeed, I feel that it is only through God's grace and mercy that I have been preserved." The three friends endeavoured to assure the poor dying man that his pernicious doctrines had in no way made any permanent impression on them, though Terence owned that he had often thought over what he had said, and that it had for some time raised all sorts of painful doubts in his mind which he could not get rid of. Their assurance seemed alone to bring him any satisfaction. The interview was short, for he was very weak, and that evening he died. His schoolfellows felt somewhat graver than usual for a short time, but as he had never gained their love they could not pretend to regret him. Shortly after this they fell in with the admiral, and the whole fleet sailed to the southward. Once more they were off Hong Kong. It was ascertained that large numbers of Chinese war junks were collected, keeping out of the way, as they fancied, of the outer barbarians, in the various creeks and channels which run into the Canton River. These channels were narrow and shallow in some places, and guarded with forts and booms, and natural as well as artificial bars. Nevertheless, the admiral determined to proceed up them with such part of his force most fitted for the work. The ships of war had congregated in the Blenheim passage of the Canton River. The steamers, which had gone up to explore, had reported that there was a high hill with a strong fort on the top of it on the left of the channel, and other forts on the opposite side, and that above these forts there were no less than 70 large war junks. The Chinese evidently believed that their hill fort could not be taken. Had they read the history of the battles of the English, they might have had some unpleasant misgivings on the subject. It was pitch dark as the various boats of the flotilla collected round the steamer on board which the admiral had hoisted his flag. The screw steamers towed up the boats. The three midshipmen managed to keep close to each other. In silence they glided over the smooth water, some small lights on buoys showing the passage up. It was hoped that they might surprise the enemy, but first a rocket on one side and then one on the other, answered by the fleet behind, showed that they were wide awake. "The dawn is breaking. We shall soon be in the thick of it," observed Jack. Soon after this, just through the grey twilight, a bright flash burst forth high up the hill, followed by a report, and a shot pitched into the water right ahead of the steamer, and sent its spray flying over her. With unabated speed on she went, and now flash after flash burst forth from the hill, and the shot came hissing and bounding on every side round the steamer. Still no one was hit. The steamer was making directly for the fort. Suddenly she came to a full stop. She had run on a bar formed by the Chinese for the defence of the positions. The boats ran in one upon another, but the oars were got out, and they were soon clear. The order was then given to land, and storm the fort. A steep side of the hill was left unprotected. The simple Chinese were under the impression that no human being could clamber up it. On went the marines and bluejackets in beautiful style, about to show the Chinamen a thing or two. They reached the foot of the hill. Up they climbed as if it was no impediment whatever. But the Chinamen did their best to stop them. It was no child's work. Jingle balls and round shot came crashing down on the assailants, and stink pots and three-pronged spears, and heads and arms and legs were shot off, and many a tall fellow bit the dust. Post captains and commanders and lieutenants went ahead of their men, and the midshipmen followed quickly after. "This puts me in mind of old days on the coast of Syria," observed Murray to Rogers, as he thought, but getting no answer. He looked round, and to his dismay discovered that Jack was not by his side. "He is hit," thought Alick, and it went to his heart that he could not go back to help him. But duty pointed the way to the top of the hill, while the glance over his shoulder had shown him his old schoolfellow rolling down it. Terence, who was a little to the right, also saw what had occurred. "Oh, we must go and help him," he cried out. But at that instant up jumped Jack again, and began to scramble up the hill with such energy that he was very soon abreast of his friends. "I am all to rights," he shouted out. "I put my foot on a rolling stone, and over I went." Terrific was the noise, the shouting and the shrieking, loud above all which aroused the British hurrahs as they clashed up the steep ascent. The Chinese happily could not sufficiently depress their guns, or a shower of grape would have made sad havoc in the ranks of the assailants. Now the marines and bluejackets were near the top. A huge Chinaman stood there, pointing his matchlock at Jack. Murray fired his pistol at him, but missed him. The matchlock hung fire, so he dashed it at Alick's head, and then hurled at them a couple of heavy shot. Terence was springing on, when the Chinaman seized a long spear, and was hurling at him with an accuracy which might have been fatal, when Jack leaped to his friend's aid, and with his pistol shot their enemy dead. The rest of the defenders of the fort, seeing the death of their brave, grinned horribly, and whisking round their tails, walked leisurely down the opposite side of the hill. More than one volley from the marines was required to make them run. They were braves selected for this post of honour and of danger. Perhaps they had suspicions that their heads might be cut off when they got back to their friends. The English flag was hoisted on the fort, and some of the guns turned down on the fleet of junks below, with whom not very injurious shots were exchanged. The marines occupied it, while the greater part of the bluejackets descended to their boats, the 3 midshipmen being among the number. On screwed the steamers, and on dashed the boats. They were soon up with the 70 junks, which began firing away most furiously, round shot and grape and langrage. The latter, scraps of old iron, they were fond of using, and terrible are the wounds caused by it. The steamers and the boats returned the compliment. Faster and more furious grew the fire from the 12 guns on board each of these 70 big junks. But one, larger than the rest, lay across the channel. The midshipmen dashed at her. A terrific fire of grape saluted them. But they were already close under the guns when they went off, and the shower of missiles passed over their heads. As the Chinamen were looking out, expecting to see their mangled limbs and fragments of their boats scattered far and wide, the jolly tars, unharmed, were climbing up the side of the junk, and a few pokes with their cutlasses soon sent every mandarin and seaman leaping overboard. Scarcely had the victors time to look about them, than the prize was found to be on fire, fore and aft. "To the boats! To the boats!" was the cry. The seamen had barely time to obey the order and to shove off, then up went the junk into the air with a loud roar, and very soon afterwards down came her fragments rattling around the boats. very nearly swamping them, and wounding several poor fellows among their crews. As the boats emerged from the smoke, the rest of the junks were seen in full flight in different directions, but a great number were overtaken, and as the British got alongside, the crews deserted them. In many of them the flames immediately burst forth, and one after the other, as they drifted on the shore, they blew up. Some were deserted by their crews before they had time to set them on fire. Several, however, escaped, and vanished up some of the unknown creeks to the left. Meantime the steamers grounded, and at length the boats alone, with the gallant Commodore leading, dashed away up the river in hot chase of the fugitives. Numbers of the junks were passed, deserted or stranded. For 4 miles they pulled on till they reached a fort on an island in the middle of the stream. There was a passage on each side, but so narrow that 2 boats could not pass abreast. Above it appeared a fleet of junks. Again the shot came rattling furiously among them. Several boats were struck. Many fine fellows, officers and men, were killed. The Commodore's boat sank under him, and barely had he the time with his crew to leap out of her, than away she drifted with the body of his coxswain, who had been killed, and a favourite dog who would come with him towards the enemy. Several times was the passage attempted, till at length the boats retreated. Their gongs began to sound, and trumpets to brave forth notes of victory, but the Chinese braves were rather premature in their rejoicings. The boat's crew went to dinner, and while thus pleasantly engaged, notice was given that the enemy junks were getting afloat. The crew sprang to their oars. "On, lads, on!" shouted their gallant leader. Fierce was the fire they had to pass through. More men were killed, and another boat sank. Still enough remained with which to follow the enemy. The narrow passage was passed, and away in hot pursuit after the still flying junks. Manned by 100 rowers they go. The junks move swiftly, but the shot and shell go faster. One after the other the junks were deserted, but 5 were still seen ahead. "We must have them all, lads," shouted the Commodore. On they went. Suddenly they found themselves with the junks ahead in the centre of a large town with a vast population. "We must get the junks," again shouted the Commodore. The crew cheered in response to his appeal. Their shot find out the junks, and they follow. The wise Chinamen leap overboard and swim on to shore. There were plenty of spectators, many thousands looking out the windows and doors and balconies, and thinking that those outer barbarians had become rather bold and impudent. But there was a general in the city, and for his military credit he turned out his army to annihilate the invaders. Seeing this, the Commodore landed his marines, whose steady fire on the braves sent him to the right about, and made them march back again in double quick time. The 5 junks were then taken in tow, and, very much to the enlightenment of the minds of the citizens, were carried away in triumph down the river. Altogether, upwards of 80 war junks were destroyed or captured, though for each junk thus disposed of the British lost a man killed or wounded. The 3 friends met again in the evening. Greatly to their mutual satisfaction, none of them had been hit. "We have had a pretty sharp day's work," exclaimed Jack, "but there's one thing I hope we shall get for it, our promotions." "And good luck to the wish," cried Adair, who had just filled a glass with wine. "It's little else I have got to look to keep me in food and clothing. The last letter I got from my dear friends at home gave me the pleasant information that all the family estates have been knocked down, and that it would be rather worse than useless for me to draw any bills in future on my agents. What knocking down means, I don't quite know, but the matter of the not drawing bills sufficiently elucidates the subject to my mind." "Oh, that is a trifle," answered Rogers and Murray in a breath. "We are over well supplied, and so you can't want, you know, and then the chances are that, before long, we pick up a good store of prize money." I know, my dear fellows, I never should doubt you," said Adair warmly. "But, well, I'll come on with you when I'm hard up. But perhaps I shall be settled for some other way." "If it is a pleasant and satisfactory way, I hope so," observed Murray, pretending not to understand him. The conversation very soon came to an end by Paddy himself falling asleep, an example which the rest of the party, looking out for a soft plank, were not slow in following. After this the three midshipmen and their men returned to their ships, which sailed away on a cruise to the northward. The Dugong one day had sent two of her boats, under charge of Murray and Adair, up a river to obtain fresh provisions. The comprador, or Chinese purchaser, who acted also as interpreter, having landed to make arrangements, the boats proceeded higher up the river on an exploring expedition. At length they reached a pretty peaceful looking village, and were induced by its tempting appearance to go on shore. They strolled about for some time, looking into the houses, the natives treating them with perfect civility. At last Murray suggested that it was time to return. "A few minutes more. See, there is a curious pagoda. Let us go and visit it." The pagoda was explored, and the priests of the Buddha were seen burning paper matches before the altar. "We have had a pleasant trip. These Chinamen are really good sort of fellows," observed Terence; but scarcely had he spoken than they discovered a strong body of soldiers drawn up between them and their boats. Not a word was said, but as they advanced the troops opened fire with their jingalls and darted their pronged spears at them. "We must cut our way through the villains," cried Murray. "If we let them press on us we are done for." "I'm with you," exclaimed Adair. "Charge, lads!" With loud shouts the British seamen dashed on, but the Chinese outnumbered them as 20 to 1. Besides being all armed with jingals, matchlocks, or spears, even Murray more than once thought that it was all up with them. He was slightly wounded. A ball had gone through both of Adair's legs, and he was bleeding much, while 4 of their men were killed, and 2 others so desperately hurt that they were unable to walk without the aid of their companions. Every moment they were growing weaker and weaker. Adair, too, was suffering dreadfully from his wounds. "I can't stand it no longer," he exclaimed, at last sinking on the ground. "Go on, Alick. Leave me to my fate. If you attempt to stop you will be cut to pieces. See, there are more of the fellows gathering round us." "Leave you, Terence? I hope not," cried Murray. "Come on, lads, we'll soon put the villains to flight." Lifting up their wounded companions, the seamen made another dash at the enemy. The treatment which the dead bodies of their comrades met with showed them that they had death alone to expect, unless they gained the victory. The moment the bodies were left, the Chinese rushed forward, and cutting off their heads, stuck them on the ends of their spears, shouting in triumph. There is something peculiarly dreadful in seeing the head of a comrade who but a few short moments before was full of life, thus exposed. Poor Adair looked up. "Will my head be soon thus placed?" he said to himself. There seemed too much probability of it. Another man was so desperately wounded that he could not walk. The party, thus reduced in strength, could no longer push on towards the boats. When they halted, the Chinamen became more daring. Back to back they stood, forming a hollow square, like brave men, with their wounded comrades in the centre, resolved to sell their lives dearly if they could not drive back their assailants. Murray was again wounded. He felt himself fainting through the loss of blood. Another man sank to the ground, and several more were hit. Still loading and firing as fast as they could, they kept the enemy at bay. Yet even Murray believed that it was only a matter of time, and that every one of them would soon be numbered among the dead. Still, by voice and example, he endeavoured to keep up the courage of the men with him. At last he had to tell one of them to hold him up, for he could scarcely see the enemy crowding round them. It was a bad sign. The courage of some of the seamen began to waver, and they looked wistfully towards the boats, as if they would make a rush at them. Great was their dismay to see a body of Chinese hurry down the bank and begin to fire at the men in them. Their only chance of escape appeared destroyed. At that moment a shout was heard, followed by a rapid fire of musketry, and then came the sound of a big gun and the peculiar rattle and crash of grape. The Chinese attacking the boats wavered and fled, followed by those between the English and the river, and a party of bluejackets and marines, headed by Jack Rogers, was seen hurrying up from the water. There was no time to be lost. The Chinese might recover from their panic. So, lifting Adair and Murray on their shoulders, with the other wounded people, his men carried them to the boats. The Chinamen looked with astonishment at what had occurred, and then, recovering their senses, rushed down again towards the boats. But, though they were too late to get back their prey, they got more than they expected, for Jack Rogers, ordering the boats once more to pull round so as to present their bows to the enemy, a rattling fire of grape was thrown among them, which once more very rapidly sent them to the right about. Considering the number of wounded, Jack very wisely pulled down the river as fast as he could go. He meantime had the hurts of the wounded men bound up. Murray soon recovered, but Adair continued so weak that his friends became very anxious for his safety. Jack told Murray that the Blenny had come in directly after the expedition had started, that he had been sent up to obtain provisions at the village where they had landed the comprador, and that from the personage he had received so alarming an account of the disposition of the natives higher up, that he had hurried on in case they might be attacked. Jack was heartily glad when he got his wounded friends on board the frigate. The doctor looked grave when he saw Adair. Murray, he said, was in no danger. No one could have been better nursed than was poor Terence, and he at length gave signs that he was recovering his strength, and the doctor looked brighter when he spoke of him. Some weeks had passed when the frigate and brigs were standing in for the land. A steamer was hove in sight, and a signal was made that she had the mail bags on board. It was the first day Terence had been able to sit up in the midshipman's berth. Jack had come on board to see him. A long official-looking letter was handed to each of them. On Her Majesty's service. One was addressed to Lieutenant Jack Rogers, another to Lieutenant Alex Murray, and a third to Lieutenant Terence Adair. There was a general shout, and warm congratulations were showered on them. I ought to have said that, when last in England, they had all passed their examination for navigation, having before that passed for seamanship. They were in reality what were then called master's mates. a rank of which the more satisfactory title of sub-lieutenants had been given. They were appointed to different ships on the station, when in their new rank they performed a number of their very gallant acts, which may some day be chronicled for the benefit of my friends. However, as they now belong to a higher rank, I must bring to a termination the adventures of my old schoolfellows, the three midshipmen. End of chapter 34. End of the Three Midshipmen by William Henry Giles Kingston.